Sancho, and I'm a Chancellor's Fellow at the Department of Science, Technology and Innovation Studies. I started working here in January, so very recently. But while attending this seminar series, I have realized that we have lots of interest in common. I'm also interested in computers, in data, in the social dimension of informatics, but I address all these topics from a slightly different perspective. I'm a historian of biomedicine by background, and in the last few years I've been working on the emergence of recent late 20th century biosciences, mainly biotechnology and genomics, which from the mid-1970s onwards were gradually differentiated as different fields when compared to the previous discipline of molecular biology. And I think a key factor in this disciplinary differentiation were the increasing interactions between biology and computing over the second half of the 20th century, especially in the analysis of biomolecular sequences, which are the sequences of amino acids, the chemical constituents of proteins, and the sequences of nucleotides, the chemical entities which make DNA, our genetic material. So, these increasing interactions between biology and computing have fascinated researchers involved in those new fields. They have highlighted these interactions along with other commentators such as policymakers or science popularizers, and they have considered the interactions between biology and computing as a distinctive feature of biotechnology and genomics. And if we look, for instance, at this quotation from the Gene Wars, which was one of the first popular accounts of the Human Genome Project, written by Robert Cook Deegan, a senior administrator in the project, he defends that from the 1970s onwards, there has been a natural marriage between biology and computing because DNA and protein sequences, due to their linear structure, were amenable to computer analysis without further manipulation. And a consequence of this, which was already anticipated by Walter Gilbert, a key participant in the Human Genome Project, was that a new theoretical biology would emerge, engaged in the computation of data from DNA sequences rather than on test tube experiments. So I think these two arguments of a natural marriage between biology and sequences of biology and computing, and of biology becoming an information science, have permeated and spread among people, and they conform our current view of the current biosciences. But as a historian, I have always thought that there is something problematic with them. Because with the argument of the natural marriage, I think there is a certain degree of teleology. It presents the convergence between biology and computing as something inevitable, something predetermined. And things normally tend to happen more randomly. Things are normally dependent upon multiple choices, upon complex, twisted, and interconnected pathways, and they don't tend to happen in this linear fashion. And with the argument of biology becoming an information science, there is a problem of technological determinism. Because when a new technology, such as computing, enters a scientific field such as biomedicine, there tends to be a reciprocal interaction, and biology can affect computing as much as computing affects biology. So what I want today is to offer you a different account, which is more complex, historically grounded, and is based on two hypotheses. The first one, that when we propose a natural marriage between biology and computing, we should see both biology and computing as historical entities, which evolve and change over time, and it may be the case that the natural marriage only happens with certain specific computing technologies and biomedical data. And with biology becoming an information science, we should acknowledge that when a technology, computing, is implemented into a new field, such as a biomedical laboratory, there is, as many of you have already explained much better than me in previous edition of this seminar, a process of socialization by which biomedical researchers who learn the new technology And the new technology and its associated personnel, the computers and the IT staff, have also need to adapt to the expectations and the necessities of the biomedical researchers. So, taking these 2 points in mind, let's see now when and where computers began being used in biomedicine. So, one of the first areas was X-ray crystallography, which is a field which enables to determine the three-dimensional structure of proteins. In this field, after World War II, there were a number of researchers who started using computers in order to perform the complex calculations which are required to reconstruct the protein structure from the black and white two-dimensional pattern that researchers obtained after they submitted a protein to X-ray radiation. So a leading institution in this field was the Cavendish Laboratory, which was a research center in physics during World War II, but after the war began hosting an increasing number of physicists interested in biology. One of these biologically minded physicists was Francis Crick, that many of you probably know as the co-elucidator of the double helix of DNA, but another one, which is more relevant for our story, was John Kendrick. John Kendrick has been mobilized during World War II, and he has been working on operations research. And due to this background and his new job as a protein crystallographer at the Cavendish Laboratory, he started a cooperation with the mathematics department of Cambridge, which was the home of the powerful mainframe computer EFSAC. These computers were very different from what we are used now. They were much larger and they were fitted into centers of calculation which were external to the laboratories. And after World War II, the EFSAC operators were looking for new partners. They had been involved in wartime research, and after the war, in the 50s, the life sciences looked like a very good area to penetrate because it was an area related to life and related to peace and very different from wartime related research. So the cooperation started in 1952, and it required a significant number of staff, mainly women who were employed by the Cavendish Laboratory, and what they did was processing the data before the data was submitted to the mainframe operators, and then helping to analyze the results when they were sent back from the center of calculation to the laboratory. And this work was crucial for the determination of the three-dimensional structure of hemoglobin and myoglobin, which are both proteins that help transport the oxygen in blood, by Kendrick and his Cavendish colleague Max Perutz. And for this achievement, they were awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1962. So that same year, in 1962, and due to the success of these Nobel Prizes, Kendrick, Perutz, and the other Cavendish biologists were transferred to a new institution, the Laboratory of Molecular Biology of Cambridge, which had been funded that same year by the Medical Research Council, which did a significant investment in what was then seen as a new and promising field of molecular biology, of molecular analysis of biomedical molecules. So there, Crick, Perutz, and Kendrick were joined by a new team leader, Frederick Sanger, who had also won the Nobel Prize in 1958 for the determination of the amino acid sequence of the protein insulin. But in contrast with Kendrick and Perutz, Sanger did not use computers in his early sequencing efforts. He preferred to look at the results with the eyes and manually reconstruct the sequence from those experimental results. And this was despite all the computing expertise at hand at the laboratory, and despite some people at the other side of the Atlantic having begun work specifically to computerize protein sequencing. That people were Margaret Dayhoff and Robert Leslie at the National Biomedical Research Foundation in Washington. Between the early and the mid-60s, they have been developing software to specifically help with the analysis of protein sequences, and in 1965 they started publishing the Atlas of Protein Sequence and Structure, which was a catalog of all the available protein sequences which was updated roughly every year. And also, at the same time, in Cambridge itself, a former student of Pelut, Olga Kenner, established a database with protein crystallographic computations which enabled to reconstruct the three-dimensional structure of proteins. But this database was housed in a different institution, independent from the Laboratory of Molecular Biology of Cambridge, and the connections between these database institutions and molecular biology or other biomedical fields were rather tenuous. And this was because this specialization in the computer side of biomedical research being regarded at this time by many biomedical researchers still with reservations. Because, well, Margaret Dayhoff and Olga Kenner were both of them women, as were the people employed by the Cavendish Laboratory to help to compute protein sequences. And at that point, the biomedical establishment was, and still to a large extent is, formed by men. So, between the 60s and the 70s, the real biomedical research was that performed with test tubes. And data gathering, data analysis, and data computation were equated with natural history as a mere stamp collecting which didn't have a direct bearing on experimental practice. So Kenner and Dayhoff were seen as best as secretariat, and that was one of the reasons why the computer at that point was only used in some very specific fields of biomedicine, many of them considered as secondary and marginal. And in other words, biomedicine was not at all considered at that point as an information science. The computer hadn't penetrated widespread the biomedical laboratory. So Sanger, the sequencing scientist in Cambridge, only started using computers in the late 70s. When he had shifted from protein to DNA sequencing, and he had embarked in a project to determine the genome sequence of a virus, the virus VX174. And a very important actor in this early use of computers in DNA sequencing was Roger Staden. Staden has been a technician at the crystallographic division in Cambridge, and he made the move to the Sanger sequencing group and started designing the first DNA sequencing software between 1977 and 1979. This enabled him to build a scientific career. He did the shift from a technician to a faculty member. And a main novelty he introduced into this DNA sequencing stuff was that this software was run not in mainframes but in mini-computers. These mini-computers were a new generation of machines. They had started in the late 60s, and they could be fitted within specific rooms in a laboratory as shared facilities. And they could be, therefore, directly handled by the researchers. So what Staden wanted with this software and running it in mini-computers was to engage researchers with the software. So the researcher would be in control of the gathering, of the processing, and of the editing of the DNA sequences. And he was successful in this strategy because the mini-computers overcame the barrier between the sequencing scientists and the previous software run in mainframes. And another key feature of the mini-computers was that they were much better adapted to DNA and protein sequences. Why? Because given that the separation between the computers and the users was smaller, and so therefore the users could spend more time directly handling the software, some people in the 1970s had started to use the mini-computers in the processing of texts. So in the early 80s, Staden started to adapt the algorithms of the very first text processors to the specificities of the DNA sequences. So this is a quotation from a paper he wrote in 1982 in which he considers the DNA sequences a series of 7-character words written in an alphabet of 4 characters, the 4 DNA nucleotides, the 4 DNA chemical units, adenine, cytosine, guanine, and thymine. And in this same paper, he proposed to implement, to adapt tools such as hash coding or separate chaining, which enable to search for words in a text, to the specificities of the DNA sequences, so it would be able to do searches and to detect patterns within the DNA sequences. So it was at this time when the marriage between computing technologies and DNA sequences occurred. And this marriage required a specific form of software, the text processing algorithms, and a historically specific form of hardware, the mini-computers which enable to conduct the gathering and the analysis of the data within the same location, in this case the laboratory of molecular biology. And also the text processing algorithms and the mini-computers were more adaptable to analyze strings of interconnected characters, in contrast of the previous sequencing software and the previous mainframes, which were more suited to independent or itemized data, such as numbers, which can be used in calculations, but they aren't connected in a string as the text or the sequences are. So within this hardware and software, the DNA sequencing software spread within the networks of molecular biology. It could be fully used within the laboratories of molecular biologists without having to send the data remotely. And this created an associated problem, which was the storage of the increasing DNA sequences which were determined with the new software. So this problem was solved not in Cambridge, but in a different international institution, the European Molecular Biology Laboratory, which had been created in 1974. It was based in Heidelberg, in Germany, and it was administered by the European Molecular Biology Organization, a transnational society which involved many European molecular biologists. It was funded by many different European states, 13 states at the time of the foundation of the laboratory. And the laboratory aimed at providing to European molecular biology services which transcended the boundaries of individual countries, of individual states. So the first Director General of the laboratory was our friend, the crystallographer John Kendrew, and given his previous background in Cambridge, he provided from the very beginning with extensive computing facilities to the laboratory. And in 1980, he issued a project to create a European centralized DNA sequence database. So this database was from the beginning conceived as a piece of shared software which would be run in microcomputers, which were the next generation of machines, even smaller than the Cambridge mini-computers, and adapted to the space of individual offices. But given that programming these devices was still difficult, they didn't have the user-friendly operating systems of nowadays, and given that many biomedical researchers within the laboratory were still pretty unfamiliar with the computer was still using very specific biomedical fields, Kendrew decided to hire staff to specifically handle the computers and handle the database project. So in 1980 he issued this job advertisement, and if you look at this section, qualifications and experience, they were looking for people with a strong background in mathematics, in physics, in computing, but not necessarily in biology. To begin with, the position was at the level of research assistant, so it was not compulsory to have a PhD in biology or in any other academic field. And while it was desirable that the candidate would have made the transition to research in molecular biology and has some previous experience surrounding nucleotide sequences, the really important requirements were familiarity with the application of numerical and statistical analysis and with the development of computer programs. And the candidates who were finally selected really fulfilled this criteria. They didn't come from biology or from any other academic background. And for example, Greg Hunt, who was the team leader, has been working in the US software industry since undergraduate graduation in the development of military software, nothing to do with biology. And then Graham Cameron, who is the current deputy director of the European Bioinformatics Institute, was a dropout from the undergraduate degree of psychology and has since worked on a database with household information at the University of Essex. So, not very formal academic training and a lot of professional experience in computing. So, if they didn't come from any established academic discipline, where did this database stuff come from? So, I think they came from what David Mindell, Thomas Hyde, and other historians of technology have called system science, which is a number of branches related to mathematics, engineering, and electronics, which developed quite independently during the 20th century, most of them outside academia and more within the corporate and business world. And they tended to converge in World War II in the form of control and command systems, which were central computers able to make predictions when they were fed with different interrelated variables. For example, an anti-aircraft system similar to the ones Hunt was working with at the US software industry could predict the position of planes and could shoot at them. And these central computers spread within the business world, within large transnational corporations, and within public administration after the war, in the form of central databases which could again make predictions about the stocks of products or personnel when they were fed with different interrelated variables. And these databases were run by people like Cameron, who called themselves systems men or information engineers. So these information engineers made the European database different from previous biomedical collections. Because if you remember the Atlas of Protein Sequence or the Cambridge Crystallographic Database, they were run by biomedical researchers, Margaret Dayhoff and Olga Kenner, these women, who were dividing their time between database work and their own biomedical research. But this European database project was from the beginning conceived as a service for the biomedical community, which would be run and administered by a specific personnel full-time devoted to that service. But this new personnel and the service they have to offer was not always very well regarded by biomedical staff, because the biologists working at the European Molecular Biology Laboratory, when they saw all these computer geeks coming from outside academia and working on a project which was, for some of them, completely alien to biology, they saw, to some extent, their identity threatened. And they tended to regard this database staff with some disregard and some suspicion. It was a situation similar to the one Kennard and Dayhoff, the two women in charge of the previous biomedical collections, had experienced 20 years before. So this problem wasn't very serious during the early 80s, because Ham and Cameron managed to release the first version of the database just by building on established computer science structure or algorithms, just by applying to the DNA sequences very simple mechanical rules in the analysis. But towards the mid-80s, there were some biomedical discoveries, such as alternative splicing, which show that the relationship between DNA sequences, genes, and proteins wasn't as simple and straightforward as expected. So the database team really needed to cooperate with the biologists. And here you have a very early email issued in 1985, in which Ham, the head of the database team, appeals for help to the biologists at the European Molecular Biology Laboratory. He claims that their biological expertise is needed in order to review the database entries and in order to resolve their considerable backlog of data. So the response by the biologists was initially quite disappointing. But towards the late 80s, there was an event at the laboratory which considerably eased things, which was the establishment at the laboratory of an official program on biocomputing. So this program provided a space of cooperation in which the interactions between the database staff and the biologists could be better managed and could be more rewarding for each side. And it also provided formal training which helped us to create a new breed of hybrid researchers which could effectively mediate between the database team and the biologists. So the database became a space of convergence, a space of collaboration, in which Han, Cameron, and other database staff released updated versions of the database, and this data was used by biologists to advance on knowledge about DNA sequences, about biology, and this knowledge, with the help of the framework of the biocomputing program and this hybrid stuff, was fed back to the database team so they could update the algorithms, refine the database, and send further updates of the database, which was again used to advance knowledge, which was fed back to them. So these symbiotic relations made the database grow and spread among biologists, and it also led the database to always embody the latest state of knowledge about DNA sequences. So this led to the growing database team to be transferred in the early 90s to a fancy new building, the European Bioinformatics Institute, which is based in a campus in Cambridgeshire, with where the Sanger Institute is also based, and which participated in the Human Genome Project. So this privileged situation of the database staff in the early 90s contrasted with the marginality and the difficulties that our two women, Dayhoff and Kennard, has experienced only 10-15 years before, in the 1970s, the decade before almost. And this was also accompanied by a gender shift in which the figures in the new discipline of biocomputing and bioinformatics were mainly, most of them, men instead of women. So the futuristic and glossy outlook of this new building, of this new European Bioinformatics Institute, I think is what leads people to think that there has always been a natural and easy marriage between biology and computing, and that biology is becoming an information science. But if we look at the stories behind the building and behind the people who work in the building, we can see that things weren't always like that. This natural marriage required, firstly, a historically specific form of software and hardware, the mini-computers and the text processing algorithms, which enabled the data analysis to be conducted by the trust network of researchers of each team. And they were also adaptable to these strings of interconnected units. And secondly, it also required a process of socialization which created this trust of this network of trust researchers working around the database, and which ultimately led to the emergence of a disciplinary framework, biocomputing and then bioinformatics, which absorbed and gave coherence and gave a space of collaboration to these pre-existing actors and practices, many of which came from outside biology and came from outside the academic world. And it ultimately linked these actors and practice to an ambitious and very well-funded project, the Human Genome Project. The problem is that when this disciplinary network, when this disciplinary framework and this network of researchers is established, when bioinformatics is established, the stories behind the pre-existing people and the pre-existing practices tends to be forgotten and tends to be rewritten in the form of very simplistic accounts, which are projected into the future in the form of expectations. And I think this is why people think that there has always been a natural marriage between biology and computing, and biology is becoming an information science. In other words, I think that the European Bioinformatics Institute and bioinformatics more generally have become the tree that prevents us to witness or to see a wonderful booth of diverse and interconnected and intertwisted historical actors and practices. And it also prevents us to tackle some impending problems, such as the problem of gender within bioinformatics. And it also prevents us to take into account this past when we assess the implementation of new technology and when we address their future implications. And this is all what I wanted to tell you today, so thank you very much.